Good morning.
Morning.
It's time to get started, so let's go ahead and pray, and then we will get started post haste. We got a lot of ground to cover this morning, so let's go ahead and hit it. Lord, thank you so much just for this opportunity. Pray, Lord, that this would be encouraging and instructive and productive, Lord, as we seek to understand the nature of how we are to look at life here under the sun. Thank you, Lord, for Koheleth and the wisdom that he's using to reveal this to us. We thank you again so much for who you are and for what you do. For it's in your son's name. Amen. Okay, so last week we had discussed some questions in our last lecture, looking at chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, verses 12 to 17, respectively. Okay. And there were a couple of questions that we wanted to ask in reference to this particular chapter, or at least the section of this chapter, is what does the following statement about laughter mean? What was his activity? And why does he come to these conclusions that life under the sun is vanity? It is temporary. It is without substance. And does Koheleth believe that pleasure is bad? We talked about this in chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, right? And that he concluded in this text. He gave us kind of the conclusion before he tells us everything. That he said, I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish, right? And so we looked at that. The term here, again, ought to be translated enjoyment instead of laughter. I think that that's more clear in relation to the context of Ecclesiastes. He's not talking about laughter as necessarily an action that one does, but a perspective that one has, right? What was his activity and why did he come to these conclusions? His activity, when observed with wisdom, reveals that there's short-term satisfaction. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we do pleasurable things is because they bring pleasure to us. That's not the problem. The issue is that are we supposed to be living for pleasure as a worldview, as an outlook? Pursuing pleasure for the sake of pleasure is irrational. It is unrealistic. And according to Koheleth, it is foolish. So does Koheleth believe that pleasure is bad? Or should we be walking around with stone faces all the time? We had looked at a couple of verses and found out that that's not. Koheleth doesn't believe that pleasure is bad. As a matter of fact, we looked at some verses that talk about enjoying yourself in various circumstances. Koheleth, again, is talking about the proper outlook concerning pleasure or enjoyment. That's what's needed. We will find this throughout the entire book. This will come up often. It's always about perception, always about outlook. It's always that. Okay? Let's continue here in verse 11. So I turn to consider wisdom, folly, or madness. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? Okay. Koheleth begins or continues really his discourse to the congregation of Israel, that he regarded the activities that he was involved in, all the things that were discussed from chapter 2, verse 4, all the way to about verse 6 or 7. And all of the works that are detailed, he turned to consider madness and folly. So now he's kind of taking his attention and turning it to these particular qualities, wisdom, madness, and folly, based upon the activities that he's done. The word consider is ra'ah. We talked about this before, and this is pointed out previously in this text. But I want to look at these verses again and kind of point out again the thing that we underscored when I talked about this word here. This word can mean to see or perceive, like kind of how I'm looking at this clicker right here. It could be literally like that, to see something or to perceive something. Now, it's not just the actual act of sight that this word underscores. Recall, this word in Hebrew is not just used to describe what a person is seeing, but also to examine the substance or the quality of a thing, like an inspector, right? Looking and seeing at something and then coming to a determination of its value or its quality based upon the details. Again, to underscore this, let's look at a couple of verses back in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 8. Notice this verse here. All things are wearisome or burdensome. Man is not able to tell or to speak of it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing. That word seeing is ra'ah, and notice what it's associated with satisfaction. Right? I mentioned before that the attitude or the prevailing mindset of a person who has this is this all there is? Is this it? Right? Looking around and not being satisfied with that. The person seeing and making an evaluation upon what they see. Verse 10 of the same chapter, chapter 1. Is there anything of which one might say, see this? It is new, already as it existed for ages which were before us. Again, the quality of seeing here is making a determination of the substance of the quality of the thing that is being observed. In this case, in chapter 10, the person is observing and asking if this thing is new or not. And Solomon makes the case that it's not new. New and improved doesn't exist, according to Kohelet. Verse 14 of chapter 1. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. Koheleth observes all the works and the activity of humanity under the sun and concludes, based upon this, that all is havel. It is temporary, it is fleeting, and it is striving after the wind. You can't hold it, you can't grasp it, you can't keep it. It just as when you want to grasp it, it slips away from you. And lastly, I said to myself, behold, verse 16, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has seen a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. This is a kind of an interesting phrase because we understand to be the mind is immaterial, right? It is not the brain, it is the mind. And Koheleth expresses the mind has seen, has observed. Well, how can a mind see, right? A wealth of wisdom and knowledge. This has to do with information, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, right? So the mind, which is capable of thought and process, observes wisdom and knowledge and the qualities of those things as being useful. Then lastly, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1. Notice this text. I've said to myself, come now, I will test or examine you with pleasure. Pleasure is the quality. So enjoy yourself. Consider with joy, right? Or see with joy, really. And behold, it too was futility, right? So every single instance here, at least so far in this text, that this word is used here, ra'ah, is not just sight, but it's seeing or perceiving, understanding the quality of something, right? And examining that. So Koheleth turns to consider the quality of wisdom, madness, and folly, right? Now, we've talked about these qualities again before in chapter 1. We've seen these words used here. Chachma, Holela, and Sikluth, right? Just to bring these up once again, wisdom in the book of Ecclesiastes is how a person ought to observe their life and activities under the sun on this land. It is philosophical in nature. Okay? The word madness, holela, is a word used to describe something that is irrational or not real. I'm going to keep driving this point home. Okay? That God's reality that he has given to us is rational. It is the true rational. It is the true reality. Anything else apart from that is irrational. It is not real. It is a fantasy. And then folly or sikluth, this Hebrew word may be underscoring either a person's actions or a person's motivations, or the outcome for their actions, right? That expression, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, right? The stupid prizes is the folly, right? Verse 11 and 12, let's consider the second half of this statement that Koheleth says. It says, for what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? Now notice here, we have the king mentioned here. This is a reference to him. Okay? But the question that he asks is very interesting. Why here in this text at this time? What will a person accomplish after what the king has already accomplished? This is an interesting question because the king has accomplished an awful lot from verses 4 to 10. Let's review some of those things here. Chapter 2, verse 4. He goes, I enlarged my works. I expanded on them. I built houses for myself, planted vineyards, made gardens and parks. I planted them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees, bought male and female bondservants, and had homeborn bondservants. I also possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Verse 8, I collected silver for myself, gold, and treasures of kings and provinces. I provided for myself males and female singers and pleasures of men, pleasures of the ear and pleasures of the body, many concubines. Right? So, after Koheleth has done all of this activity, all of this work, he asks a question. If I were to pass on and a man were to come in my place, what would they accomplish? I've pretty much done everything, right? So would they build more houses for themselves? Way to go. Add another house, right? How about building more gardens? Will they be known by that? Maybe collect more jewels and metals for themselves, maybe, right? Instead of having a trillion pounds, you have 1,000,000,001. Congratulations, right? Maybe more entertainment, more pleasurable experiences. Maybe you're going to have more than what he's done, right? What do they say? Whoever has the gold makes the rules, right? There's a saying: whoever dies with the most toys still dies. Like that's kind of what are you gonna do, right? Maybe perhaps build more, have more experiences. This brings us to verses 13 and 14. So looking at wisdom, madness, and folly, Koheleth comes to some conclusions. Verse 13 and 14, and I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. And a wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Let's take a look at a couple of things here. Koheleth then concludes, out of looking at wisdom, madness, and folly, and looking at all the things that he's built and saying, well, you can't look to what you build because you've already done that, so that's useless. Let's turn to this, wisdom, madness, and folly, concluding that wisdom has an advantage. There's a profit for wisdom rather than folly. And then uses a physical representation of this picture, light's advantage over darkness. That makes sense, right? Koheleth then switches the difference to bring up the difference between a wise man and one who is foolish. One who uses wisdom and the other who doesn't, or who rejects it. Very similar to light having an advantage over darkness. The wise man walks with eyes in his head. Again, we have an idiom here. What does this mean? Well, everybody has eyes right in their head, but why is he using this reference? Well, there's no obstruction that blocks his sight or vision. He's able to see clearly, right? Wisdom has the advantage of giving proper perspective, proper outlook about life. That's the point. Additionally, in these particular verses that are mentioned here, one who has an outlook other than wisdom, folly, foolishness, has their view obstructed. They don't see things clearly or their objectives clearly. They don't observe life clearly. And so therefore they walk blindly. Then, in the following verse, verse 14, Koheleth gives an intriguing statement. He says this in verse 14. He goes, "The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both." Well, let's look at this statement a little more closely here. Let's look at the word fate for a minute. Mikre is the Hebrew word here, occurs 9 times here in the Hebrew scriptures. This word occurs in the book of Ecclesiastes 7 times. So again, we find another frequent usage of this word as Koheleth is writing about his discourse here in this book. This underscores, this word mikre, underscores an event or a happening that occurs, which could have occurred indiscriminately, right? Or by happenstance, right? Where things happen and then boom, something happens. That's an event, a fate, right? Or translated as that. I would just translate it as event, right? There's one event that befalls them both. Let's look at the word befalls for a minute, because we don't really talk like this, like regularly, That fate befell me the other day. No one talks like that, right? It's kind of goofy. But let's take a look at this word befalls here. This word is kara. This word occurs 27 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and the Hebrew word only occurs in the book of Ecclesiastes 3 times. Okay. This word underscores here as a happening to encounter or to meet, right? If we, it's also used in that context. Remember, Hebrew is very fluid, right? So the context determines on how we are to look at this word, right? In this particular context here, this word is in the qual stem, or we would say active in the Hebrew language, right? It is not passive. It is not something that, according to Koheleth, happens to us passively. But it is like this event searches us out. Koheleth mentioned that even though wisdom gives the person the proper perspective, which is advantageous, let's not overlook that. It is advantageous. Regarding life under the sun on this land, one event or happenstance comes to claim both the wise and the foolish person, both of them. Right? This is the great equalizer, according to Koheleth. Well, as fortune would have it, Koheleth, looking at these observations in chapter 2, verse 14, and coming to this conclusion that even though wisdom is of great benefit to individuals, to have the proper perspective, he becomes very, I'm not going to say that. I'll just say he becomes very cynical, right? In his next statement. Then I said to myself, self, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. This is very fascinating. Again, we see the word here that Koheleth uses, again, is the word leb, that's highlighted in red here, that he says to himself, he's talking to himself in this event, that the event of the fool is also given to the event of the wise person, that is himself, right? And he begins to question his own possession of wisdom. Then if I'm going to die like the fool, what's the point of that then? That seems a bit ridiculous. Then he says, this too is useless. It is vanity. It is a breath. It is a vapor. Well, why would he say something like this? Why all of a sudden he would become cynical? I mean, it is good to be wise, is it not? I mean, I would think it would be good to be wise. I mean, you wouldn't want to be looked at as a foolish person. You wouldn't want to be looked at as a wise person, right? So why all of a sudden is he being so cynical about being wise then? Well, he gives us the reason in his next statement. And this is the punchline right here. In verse 14, or I'm sorry, in verse 15. He says the following, for there's no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool. Inasmuch in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool will die alike. See, it's fine to remember, it's fine not to remember a person who's foolish, right? They're dumb, don't remember them. But a wise person, they ought to remember them. Remember what they've done, remember what the decisions they made, remember their achievements, remember the things that they've accomplished. And yet he says here that people will not remember them. Hey, here's a modern example. How many people do you think remember George Washington? Just Google the word on the street, the people who ask questions. You'll be amazed at how many people don't even remember the founding of their own country. How many people, I mean, this is Solomon here, right? Richest man at the time, wisest man at the time. And no one remembers him. If that's the case, how many will remember us when we're gone? Maybe a couple, maybe our immediate family, extended family. Beyond that, 100 years from now, no one will sing your name. Let's look at a couple of words here. Lasting, the word olam here. Interesting word, 439 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 7 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay? It can be translated as eternal, forever, everlasting, long lasting, however you want to translate this. It emphasizes the length and the duration of time. Solomon comes to the conclusion that even men who are worth being remembered will not be remembered for very long. Memories of humanity is very short, right? Even the nation of Israel, who was supposed to teach the law of Moses to generations, they even forgot to do that over time. And it led to them being destroyed and brought into captivity. Even Solomon himself, who was wise, who wasn't supposed to mess with individuals who were idol worshipers. I'll just take them, that's fine. Our minds don't last very long. We tend to forget things we ought to remember. And he comes to that conclusion. Remembrance is Zikron. We talked about this when we talked about the book of Revelation. Zikron, which is a derivative or a cognate of Zikra, or Zikron, occurs 24 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It is translated as remembrance or memorial. This is why we build statues and towers and things like that, so that they would recall things in our minds that we're not supposed to forget. And yet we find that even collectively we forget those too. This underscores the function of active recall of something. So there's no lasting recall of the wise man. Now, of course, Solomon is talking about himself in this case. But again, he brings up the quality of a nature of humanity that we ought to pay attention to. We don't really think about things that are important for very long. Which he says in the second statement, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. They share the same fate. The word forgotten is the Hebrew word sakah. Again, 102 times in the Hebrew text, 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes that is used. You'll find this word very interesting. This word could be translated as forget, ignore, or cease to care. Now, I find this interesting because the stem that it is used, it is written in the passive, not the active. People just forget. It just ceases out of existence. Koheleth mentioned that the person who is wise, in other words, speaking of himself, again, because this is a personal exercise for him, he is actively doing this and looking at the conclusions of this, is given no special consideration at the end of the day under the sun. Now, again, we're talking about the perspective of humanity here. Right? Additionally, when he passes on, there really is no special consideration regarding his life in comparison to a foolish person. If you were to put his name against the fool's name, collectively humanity would never remember any of them. Who are these people? I have no idea who they are. In fact, this is kind of cool. Well, depending on how you look at it. This harkens back to previous statements he made in chapter 1. This is the reason why he set up everything the way he did. He gave us his conclusion first, worked through all the things, and now he's reinforcing what he talked about, his main thesis statement in chapter 1. Notice some of the statements he makes here. In chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, he mentions this. What advantage or profit does a man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Now we see the reason why he said this and the purpose of it. Solomon or Koheleth was a part of a generation that ceases to exist here on this planet, and we don't talk about Solomon, right? Verse 11 of chapter 1. I find this to be very fascinating here. Notice the language. There is no remembrance. There's that Hebrew word again, zikaron, of earlier things and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. Notice this word here. There's no remembrance, no memorial, no recall of earlier things and also of later things that will occur. There will be no remembrance for them. Verse 17 of chapter 2. Solomon, after thinking about his life and really the impact, he did a lot of activity. He was busy guy. He really says, well, in reality, what's the point of anything? You can't seek pleasure for pleasure's sake. That doesn't amount to anything. You're going to die and not be remembered. Even if you've made all the right choices and even if you have all the right wisdom, you're not going to be remembered for that, if at all. His conclusion, so I hated life. I hated it. Translated in English, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility. Everything is striving after the wind. Now notice his perspective is here. I want to make this clear, okay? He's looking at his activity and the perspective, the outlook of what he's doing here. And he's coming to these conclusions. Saneh is the Hebrew word here for hated. It occurs 146 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It can, in different contexts, it can be translated as enemies. It's usually translated hate or hateful most times. In the book of Ecclesiastes, this term hated that's used underscores his outlook on living. Okay? Now, he's not saying this just at random. He's doing this with his head on, with his mind clear. He's doing this activity on purpose and coming to these conclusions. This again is associated once more with statements from the previous chapter. Right? In chapter 1, verse 14, I've seen all the works, that is the activity, which has been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. This is the same word that's used in verse 17 of chapter 2. I've enlarged my activities in chapter 2, verse 4, or my work. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself, all these things. Okay? So we see that according to Solomon's outlook, his hatred or his hatefulness of life for the activity that had been done under the sun was grievous to him. This word here, ra, again, 663 times in the Hebrew scriptures, this word is used here. This word occurs 31 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Here it's frequently used. So again, this is another main theme of Solomon or Koheleth's book. Depending on the context that it is used, it could be translated evil. In some respects, it could be translated as hurt, wicked, or wickedness, if it's talking about a particular person or people. This word in this text in the book of Ecclesiastes is used to describe an overwhelming burden that causes a person to lament, to despair, to kind of throw their hands up in the air. Why am I even here? If no one's going to remember me, if my works are going to be forgotten, what's the point of even being here? Koheleth mentioned it was because of these truths that no one would remember him or his work, and that his name and reputation would be gone from humanity's memory. This would cause him to become very cynical in terms of his perspective on the activities of humanity, specifically his, right? But he makes this conclusion about the activities of humanity, generally speaking, looking at the congregation of Israel. Verse 17, he finishes up, so I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility. The result of this in striving after the wind. Again, this realization will cause Koheleth to use his main idioms here. Under the sun, which is talking about the activity under here, futility, havel, and striving after the wind. You try to grasp the wind with your hand, you can't do it, right? It is useless. It's a useless endeavor. Let's look at his conclusion here. Koheleth informs his audience about all of the activities that he completed for the sake of pleasure itself. And using the wisdom that he had, Koheleth concluded that the pursuit of pleasure for consistent satisfaction for the sake of it was a useless and profitless enterprise. In addition, wisdom does have an advantage. However, no one will remember you for it. Now, let me take a look at here. This is going to be a rather long quote. If you have my notes, it's actually on your quote here. It is a rather long, but I think it's important for our discourse here. Remember, we're trying to do a couple of things. So we're looking at Solomon's perspective, and then we're doing a comparative analysis of the philosophies that have been laid out over the centuries, right? We're trying to do some comparative work here, okay? To kind of, if nothing is new under the sun, well, we should be able to see the same trends at this time that we did with Solomon, right? Makes sense. Okay, so here we go here. I want you to take a look at this. This is the other side. Or shall I say, this is foolishness, right? Says this, I myself don't personally believe that there's any great overarching meaning to existence. But I'm not in any way opposed to this proposed solution. We must create meaning for ourselves. We must imagine ourselves happy. However, this does not fully address the existence aspect of the initial question. Much like how we needed to address the concept of no meaning, we must also address the concept of no existence. Death is an inevitability that often scares us. So how can we exist happily knowing that there will be a time of no existence for us? Does this sound familiar to you? The very same statement that this person is making is the very same subjects that Koheleth is addressing. Not just no meaning, but no existence. No existence on this plane anyway. Let's keep moving. From a very objective biological position, we must consider that our purpose is to simply exist, to eat, sleep, reproduce, and everything in between. I find that very fascinating. Isn't that something that Koheleth was just talking about in chapter 2, verses 4 and 10? Indeed, evolutionary psychology. Uh-oh. Now, you know how I feel about this. I don't have time to pontificate this morning, so I will step down from that soapbox because I've only got 3 minutes left. Evolutionary psychology focuses on a great deal on the reproductive aspect of this objective stance. Objective? Okay. But what about those who will do or will not have children? Like those who are, have complications biologically, or maybe they decide not to have kids. If the whole goal of life is to reproduce, what do you say about them? Perhaps it doesn't have to be about producing a child per se, rather creating a legacy in which our values and successes can live on. Isn't that fascinating? So my meaning of existence is to create a legacy. But if that's possible, how can I do that when no one will remember it? You see how irrational this is? This is ridiculous in comparison to God's wisdom. Maybe there's no meaning and we're stuck here on our boulders like Sisyphus, Man, doesn't that sound awfully like Koheleth at the end of what we just read? But if we take the time to identify what's important to us, what we value and the goals we wish to achieve, we create meaning for ourselves. And perhaps if we succeed, in quotes, in our existence through attaining these values and goals, we can create legacies for ourselves that allow us to live on beyond the end of our physical existence. I italicize that because the very same thing that he says here is what Koheleth is lamenting about. Your legacy won't live on. It won't. Because people will forget that it even existed. This is by no means a groundbreaking piece of advice. No Sherlock. But this evaluation does provide us a context for why it's useful to live in such a manner. If a person adopts this, they will become like Koheleth. They will become cynical. This is the question that I'll leave you with at the end of this discourse in chapter 2, verses 18 and following. If Koheleth, who has all these resources, is the wealthiest, wisest person at this time in history, has purposefully and scientifically, no quotes, this is a scientific exercise, okay, completed all these tasks for his own purpose or success, and come to realize that physical death and humanity's awareness of his activity will be lost to history, then how are we as human beings who don't even have a tenth of his resources ought to think and respond to pursuing pleasure to find purpose in this life? If he has all the resources and comes up with the fact that these things are of no value, you shouldn't be looking to these, how ought we, who don't even have a tenth of what he has, ought to respond? We will continue chapter 2 next week, Lord willing. Let's pray. Thank you, God, for showing us how irrational our thinking could be and how we often look to the wrong things to pursue as giving meaning to our lives. Koheleth is not done taking a sledgehammer to all the things that we admire and adopt if we have these perspectives. He will not leave us there, though, and we thank you, Lord, that he's using your wisdom to guide him in his observations. I pray, God, that we would continue to think about this, that we would continue to focus on the things that are true and that are eternal, things that last. We thank you so much, Lord, for who you are and for what you have given to us through Kohath. For it's in your Son's name. Amen.